This here is Mafrancia Polymorpha. It's a bryophyte, so it is a non-vascularized land plant. The structures that we see here are the thallus. It's a dioecious plant, so there are male and female thallus. This is Sala Janella, and it is a lycophyte, and it's the only genus in its family. It's an example of a vascularized land plant containing a protostele, which is considered a more primitive arrangement of the stele and its vascular tissues. What we see here is the Sporophyte, which produces spores of two different sizes. So there are megaspores and microspores, which will lead to male and female gametophytes. This is Psilotum nudum. It's a plant that resembles a fern, but is not a true fern, since it does not have true leaves nor roots. This is one of two species in its genus. It is a spore-producing plant. Here we can see the structures, the yellow structure, which contains the mature spores. This plant has a very interesting reproductive cycle, which depends greatly on microscopic fungi, mycorrhizae. The sporophyte that we see here is photosynthetic, but the gametophyte is not photosynthetic and depends entirely on mycorrhizae for its survival. So we also have a large selection of ferns. Ferns are vascularized land plants that use spores as a means of reproduction. They have true leaves, true stems, and true roots. This is Dryopteris cristata. Pteris ensiformis. We also see there's a lot of diversity in the morphology of the fronds. So Asplenium nidus has a very simple frond. This Asplenium nidus is originally an epiphyte. Another example of an epiphytic fern is Platycerium bifurcatum here. Common name is the staghorn fern that has fronds that resemble these kind of stag horns. We have a much larger example in the corner up here. You can see this one has mature spores on it. And so a diversity of ferns. Cirtomium falcatum, this one also produces a lot of spores. Davalia bulata is one of my favorite ferns. The common name is rabbit's foot fern. Because it produces these rhizomes that are fuzzy and look like little rabbit's feet. And here's another Polypodium aureum, also has a very pronounced rhizomes. This is an example of a gymnosperm. Sica revoluta. So gymnosperms, the Greek origin of the root gymnosperm literally means a naked seed. So these are plants that produce cones that contain the seed, and the seed is naked, so it's not wrapped in anything or protected by any fleshy tissue like a fruit. Sica is dioecious, so they have male and female individuals. This one is fairly young. It's about 3 to 4 years old. We can see that it's getting a new set of leaves here. Up here we have a slightly older specimen. So this one's about 12 to 15 years. And then behind me is our collection's oldest specimen. So this particular one is a female, and it's about 45 years old. This is another example of a tropical gymnosperm, Damiakoresi. So it's also a dioecious species, meaning that there are plants that will produce male cones, which contain the pollen, and there are plants that will produce the female cone, which contain the ovary and will lead to the seed. This particular one is a male, so we can see the male cones on it. So the next group is angiosperms. Angiosperms are very diverse, and we have several examples here in the greenhouse. Among angiosperms, there are monocots and dicots, A good example of a monocot that we have here is Ananas camosus. You'll probably recognize this as the pineapple. So if we look at keys to identify a monocot, so it has leaves that all have parallel veins. They're a little bit hard to see, but we can see that the veins all run parallel in the leaf. The absence of secondary growth, so no woody structure present. So we have a young fruit on here, but it flowered before, and the flowers clearly had 3 petals. So petals in multiples of 3 are indicative of monocots. So it's really interesting to see here that all of these are spent flowers. So they're actually all individual flowers that eventually fuse together to make the fruit that we can consume. This here is the crown, so the leaf. And what's interesting about pineapple is that you can harvest, when you harvest the pineapple, you can take the crown here, cut it off, and you can replant this, and it will lead to the next plant to produce the fruit. So this one was the previous crown from the previous fruits, and I've been doing this for a while now, so this is, I think, 6th or 7th generation of pineapple plants. Here we have another example of a tropical monocot, so an angiosperm. It's Musa acuminata, which is the banana plant. So this is a dwarf variety, so it's a smaller individual. If we look at the leaves, we can see that all the veins in the leaves run very parallel to each other and never meet, so a good indicator of a monocot. And if we look at the base, it doesn't have any woody tissue, so it doesn't have secondary growth. So the term banana tree is actually very misleading because it is not a tree. It's a herbaceous perennial that grows from an underground rhizome, not a tree. So this here is Tillandsia usneoides. The common name is Spanish moss. However, it is not a moss at all. It is an angiosperm and a monocot. So the flowers have 3 tiny little petals, and it's in the bromeliad family, so same family as the pineapple. So it is an epiphyte. An epiphyte means that it doesn't have any roots. It absorbs everything that it needs from the rain and the atmosphere, and it just uses other structures for a structural support. So, Spanish moss. So one more example of an angiosperm monocot is the orchid. The orchid can be a little bit tricky to identify because it has 3 sepals that resemble the petals that are the same color. But if you look closely, it does in fact have 3 sepals and 3 petals. The lower petal is modified for the reproductive structure, and it's called the lip or the labellum. So this plant here is Sakaram Officinaran. You might recognize it as sugarcane. It is an angiosperm and a monocot. If we look at the leaves, they have all parallel veins running in the leaves, and the absence of secondary growth. So sugarcane grows very big in the fields and the big stalks like this one. I have an example that I've cut here. This is what is cut and is then pressed to extract the juice, and the juice is then refined and processed to extract crystallized sugar, which is the sugar that we consume. So if we move on to Dicot Angiosperms, this is an example. It's Nicotiana affinis. It's a plant in the tobacco family. So if we look at the flower, they are fused, but they're in multiples of 5. So flowers in multiples of 4 or 5 are indicative of a dicot. And if we look at the leaves, they have reticulated veins that cross each other, as opposed to monocots, which they're all parallel. So very indicative of a dicot. So as I mentioned, this is Nicotiana affinis, so it's a plant that is used to produce the tobacco. So we have to take a few moments to look at Mimosa Pizzica. It's always a highlight of the visit. So Mimosa Pizzica is a touch-sensitive plant. So if I were to go and stimulate some of the leaves here, you'll see that they react in a very surprising manner. So the leaves close up when you stimulate them. The plant does this to protect itself from herbivores, so it's from predators. And if we let it be, the leaves will reopen in about 5 minutes. This here is Papaya arabica. It is an angiosperm and a dicot. So if we look at the leaves, we can see that they have very reticulated veins, small veins that cross each other. And we also see the presence of the secondary growth, so the woody structure. So this is, you can see some of the fruit the young fruit that is here. So this is the coffee tree. So the fruit will turn red when they mature. And then the fruit is harvested, and if we open it inside, we have the 2 seeds that are extracted. They look like this, and then when they are roasted, they become black and very fragrant, and that's what we use to grind up and make coffee. This here is Citrus orangifolia. It's an angiosperm and a dicot. If we look at the leaf here, we see again the reticulated veins. The flowers have multiple petals and multiple of 4 or 5. And we can see the secondary growth, the wood structures here. And you can see the fruit that is produced. So this is a lime tree. The morphology of flowers can be very diverse. Here's a nice example. This is Acalifa hispidia. And you can see that it has very unusual flowers. And the vine that is growing behind there is Passiflora edulis. If you've ever seen a passion flower, it's really spectacular. It has very pronounced reproductive structures. Our specimen here finally produced its first flower during the pandemic. And I hand-pollinated it, so it did lead to a very nice passion fruit, which I was able to harvest and enjoy. Another example of a plant that we have that is very popular as a house plant right now is the philodendron. So this one is also getting fairly big, but it's a very, very nice specimen. And here we have Carica papaya, so it's the papaya fruit. Carica papaya is a very good example of a dioecious fruit. So we have female individuals that will produce the flower that contains the ovary, and then there are male individuals that produce the flowers that have the pollen. So the pollen will fertilize the female flower, which will lead to the fruit. So you must have female plants to lead to fruit production. The male only supplies the pollen, does not produce any fruit. So this specimen here is Monstera Deliciosa. It is very popular right now as a house plant. This particular individual is very, very nice. I recently transplanted it because it was a little bit pot-bound, so it had some nutrition deficiencies. But we can see that it's doing really well. The leaves are just huge and spectacular. So this plant here is very interesting. It's Strelitzia regina. It's called bird of paradise. So it has these very showy flowers that look a little bit like birds of paradise. The plant is indigenous to South Africa, where it has co-evolved with its pollinator. So the flower produces a lot of nectar to attract the bird. So the pollinator is a small warbler. It's also native to South Africa. And the specific weight of this particular bird, when he perches here on the purple part to drink the nectar, just the weight of that bird will open up to reveal the pollen, which is then transferred onto the bird's feet. And the plant knows that the bird will go visit another flower of this particular species. So it's a very nice example of coevolution. This is Neoregelia. It is an epiphyte in the bromeliad family, so it doesn't have any roots. The way that it blooms, it forms these little rosettes in which water accumulates, and then the flowers occur in there. It's in the same family as the pineapple, so it's interesting. The pineapple was originally an epiphyte as well. It has been domesticated through agriculture to be able to grow in fields.